Hello again, and welcome back. So we're going to jump back just for a moment, again to our 3D model, and talk about lighting our model properly, and that'll sort of conclude this project for our Grayscale architectural city that we've made. And then we'll go and we'll jump into 2D and we'll talk about how to create lighting and shadow for our 2D scene in Photoshop. So if you are doing 2D, once again, I'll say skip ahead a little bit in this video and jump over to that. Okay, so first, this is the city that we were looking at last time. I put in just a regular light to sort of move it around and see what I like for my city lighting. Figure out, and I can use this, of course, to help figure out where my lighting and shadows are going to fall. What you'll notice is this light is pretty bright. If I go into my modifiers, this is just an Omni light. If you're not familiar with Macs, the bands that you see around this light are where your fall off begins for your lighting. You can turn your light on or off, right? You can turn your shadows on or off. You probably won't see shadows in the viewport window if you're using Macs, but in some in some software you will. Blender usually reacts pretty quickly if you're using the correct shaders. Okay, also one of the things that we want to check out on our modifier panel here is we've got our multiplier. Our multiplier says, you know, how bright or how dark our lighting is going to be. I think I had it around 74, 75. And you can also choose colors. If I pull in this palette here, you can choose different colors. If you wanted to create sort of maybe more of a night scene or something like that, you could do that. Now, you don't have to use colored light, but if you want to get a head start on Project 5, where we're going to actually be doing photo texturing to our city, you might want to drop in color lights. That's perfectly fine. Your city is still grayscale, it's just the lighting that is a little bit different. One of the nice things about dropping in a color light is that you tend to see, obviously, different colors, right? So here's my key light in the scene. Oops, let's grab the key light. Right, here's my key light, and then I would have my ambient light, which is in this case a little bit more orange. You can adjust the fall off. You'll notice that you can do that by adjusting this. Regardless of what 3D program you are using, one of the things that you'll probably want to do with your key light is change your decay to inverse square. You can have no decay, which will just blow out your whole scene. You can have inverse, which is manageable, but accurate lighting uses inverse square. So that's what I've set this to, and then you would adjust your lighting as appropriate. Now let's say I would like to have another light in the scene, right? I want to have maybe 3 lights in the scene. A regular light, an ambient light, and maybe a backlight. So for my fill light, what I might do is I might treat this light a little bit differently. I might bring it up here. I might take the decay and I might just set it to none. I will obviously have to turn that light down significantly. And I may darken it and turn the saturation way down. Maybe something like that. One thing that I want to make sure that I do with an ambient light, though, is turn shadows off. I just want this to be a fill. I want my key light to be the only thing that really casts shadows in my scene. Okay. And then if I wanted, I could also have backlights or accent lights. And if I wanted to create a contrast, I would choose not blue, not purple. I would probably want to choose something more like a goldenrod type of a color. And you can sort of see what a nice pop of color that brings. Again, I'll turn the shadows off. But if we had a city scene that looked like this, right? It kind of looks like the sun's coming up over the horizon. We get still a little bit of that darkness, that darker sky color from above, and then we also have our key light color, which might be moonlight or light that's maybe even coming from another building in the area or signs in the area. It could just be a color that we use to offset our accent light or our backlight here. I'm going to turn this down even more though. Right? And as we turn it down, we can see that blue becomes a lot more dominant. And so you can play around with your lights. You can adjust the colors and shadows of those different lights, but I would recommend keeping your shadows basically to one main light. The only exception that I would have for you is if you had, say, a sign or something like that you're going to be putting on the front of your building. Definitely you're going to want to pull in your little decay sphere. You're definitely going to want to keep your shadows on. You're probably going to want to turn your multiplier down, and you'll have to find, you know, the right light color for your sign. Right? That might be a little overwhelming, and you would just want to make sure that it's going to be in the area where you're going to place your sign. Really bring that light in, right? So I don't recommend doing night scenes because there's a lot of light placement that you would have to do, and getting it to look just right is somewhat difficult. But in the case of signs, don't forget signs are going to have a local color associated with them, and they are also probably going to cast shadows. So in addition to basically your main scene light, you'll also cast shadows with some of these other little ones. I'm going to go ahead and delete this one though. But you can see actually lighting your city in 3D is not too bad. And then what you would do from here is you would go ahead and take a render of this, bring it into Photoshop, and then that would be your submission. Again, your lighting doesn't have to be in color. Your lighting can just be grayscale, and you can add the color in later. So if we go back now to Photoshop, again, we've got our two artboards here. We have our forge where we've created all of our different building and roadway sections, and then we have sort of our filled in grayscale buildings. Now what you'll see over here off to the side is I've actually already gone in and I've done a series of lighting and shadows to different parts of our base scene here. So I'm going to bring them in sort of one by one so that you can sort of see how this is going to look, and then I'll go in and show you how to proceed with all of these. So the first thing that we'll see is lighting and shadow on stonework. This is just to give a little extra hit of light to sort of the top of the building and sort of carry a little bit of darkness and maybe a little bit of detail a little bit lower. Okay, so how do I achieve this effect? Pretty simple. All you would do is you would make a new layer. You go back to your background, go ahead and select. You know, you can change your tolerance, by the way, for your selection. The higher tolerance you have, the more things you'll select in your scene. Right, that'll select your whole entire scene. But if I turn my tolerance way down on my Magic Wand selection tool here, let's turn it down even further. Right, it'll only select certain things. So I would keep your tolerance pretty low if you've done just flat color. On your new layer, I'd recommend going into your paintbrush, into your tool presets. You'll see the very first one is called Zero Block. We used it on these buildings back here. And all you're going to do is just grab you know, some gray in the scene, just using your Alt key, and right, you can just gently brush in just a little bit of texture. Now, why are we doing this? We're doing this because, you know, when you look at brick faces, for example, so this would be brick or masonry on the outside of the building. Brick and masonry do not have even value tones to them. Different parts of brick age at different rates. Sometimes brick walls aren't necessarily all made of the same type of brick. Brick gets dirty. Some of the dirt from that brick runs down the building. So you don't have to put in a great deal of detail, but I'd recommend putting in, you know, a little bit of work just to add some visual interest. Again, just a few strokes. Just make sure that those strokes are going with your architecture. Okay. You might add in additional, you know, value changes to, say, the top of your masonry, or divisions between floors, or things like doors, that sort of thing. And you don't have to use just your zero block in your tool presets. Another thing that you can use is Airbrush Soft. You can see that I've got some airbrushing done up at the top here. I turn this off, right, and I go back to my background here. I'm just going to go ahead and select that, right, and I would just use my airbrush and I would just gently brush that in. Remember to keep things lightest, closest to your camera. It's a pretty important thing. And remember not to get things too white, too bright. But you can see as I add that lightness to the corner, it really brings this whole side of the building forward in a big way. So yeah, so that would be something that I would do then with all of the stonework, right? I'd add a little bit more detail. Another thing that I would want to do is something with these windows. Remember, we've kept all of our windows on a single layer, and you can see, if I drop in my window lighting, you can see what a difference that makes as well. So let's talk about windows and how reflections are going to work in your city. You don't have to keep your reflections looking absolutely 100% perfect, certainly not for this particular project. Perhaps in the future, in some other project that you are working on, you will need to have completely accurate reflections in your city scene. In this particular case, I'm not too worried about it, but you will want to make some adjustments to your windows to make them not look flat, right? So one of the things that's important to remember about reflections is that they happen just on the other side of the symmetry axis, right? So if your window is reflecting this side of the street, you probably will see on a new layer here, you'll probably see some of the walk and some of the street sort of back off into the distance. And it's not going to be very, very clear at all, right? You might also see this tree reflected in the window here. Right? And we're just basically taking that over and up. Might be something like that. And then on this side of the street, again, we'll pull in from what's being reflected. Remember, this wall is an axis. We'll darken the tops of those windows because the interior of these windows is going to actually be probably a darkened shop. So where the parts that we're not seeing that are not reflected, rather, are going to be darker. And we might see that darkness up in these windows here. And then we might have a little bit of light hitting these upper windows up at the top. And this sort of suggests that maybe there's a building across the street, right? Something like that. Right, but windows aren't just one solid color. They're not white, they're not gray, they're not black. They're a number of different values and colors, right? Because they're just sort of like imperfect mirrors. So remember to think of the line that they're on, the perspective line that they're on. That's the axis that you're going to be reflecting over. Same thing on this side, right? So your mirror is here. What does the mirror see that's on this side? If the mirror is over here, what does it see that's on this side, right? And then you're going immediately, you know, basically taking that 180 degrees over to the other side. So you can see, even just with really basic treatments to things like your windows and your stonework, everything is starting to flesh out a little bit more. So here I've added in like a building accent. I've added in just a little bit more light up at the top here. I've also added in some darkness down a little bit more toward the bottom here, just to give the top a little bit more punch. Another thing that tends to flatten your scene out is your line work, kind of like we talked about with your character. Now, your line work can be blended away if you prefer using your mixer brush tool. You can certainly do that if you wish. For this particular project, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it because we are going to be going over that line work later, and we're going to be adding in photo textures. And so I would recommend keeping your line work around because it will provide you with a framework so that you know exactly how to distort those textures onto your building surfaces. Don't go too wild with like erasing them. However, if you wanted to make things a little bit more presentable, one thing that you could do is control-click on your line work, and then on a new layer, you could do just kind of what we did with our character project, and that is just kind of go over those lines with a bit of a value change. Right, and that'll take some of the edge of some of those lines off, and you can play around with different values. This is really just kind of, you know, what ends up looking good. You don't necessarily want your line work to look like, you know, too bright, nor do you necessarily want it to look too dark, and you definitely don't want it to just fade away into the building. You're better off having it, I think, too dark than too light. But yeah, you know, you can play around with some different ideas with your line work. So again, I've already done that, so I've added that in, and that gives, again, makes the line work recede just a little bit for right now. I've got also my streetlights. Now, one thing that I noticed with my streetlights in my scene is compositionally, this is a problem, right? This is a split edge, and if I move it over here, I've got kind of like a shared edge or a skimmed edge problem. So I'm actually going to move this over to the side of the curb, and I'm not quite sure that that's necessarily accurate to how it would actually be on the street, but I do know that it looks better, and that overlap looks a little bit better. And then basically, if I wanted to add in any sort of shadow, one thing I can do is just Alt-click drag that layer, put it behind, double-click the layer, create a color overlay that is black, go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, And I can create a shadow for this. Now remember, shadows follow surfaces. So this would probably need to be distorted. Right, as it sort of goes along the side of the building. Right, we know the light's hitting it and then it's distorting this direction. I'm going to erase that. I don't need any shadows for this guy, and I don't need any shadows for this guy. Right, and then as shadows recede, they do tend to get a bit lighter with fall off. So I'm going to just take this light eraser and add just a little bit of erasure to the end of this. Right? In fact, I like this shadow better than the one that I had before. So let's go ahead and keep that, and we will call this one Streetlight Shadow. And I will go ahead and flag that as yellow. I've also got lighting that I can put on my street lights. So to do that, I would control click of the street lights, and then I would grab, you know, my zero block brush and just go ahead and add lighting as appropriate. Now, one other thing that I want to do is I want to make sure that these buildings look like they're part of a scene. And one of the things that I can do is imply that there are other buildings in the scene. And to do that, I'm going to actually put in some shadows from across the street. So how do I go about doing that? Well, you make a new layer, and then you would just use your Polygonal Lasso tool. Remember, everything follows planes, right? So you take your lasso, it goes across the street, your shadow will go up the side of the building. Try not to skim the edges of these windows here. Make sure that your shadow follows the perspective, right? Follow the lines that you see on the windows. And remember that the shadow is going to sort of bow out. Remember, there's perspective on the street here. The shadow is going to follow a perspective, and then it's going to go up the side of the building. So on my new layer, I would just do a black fill on that. Let's go ahead and turn off our trees for right now. Right, and I could also do another building over here. If I desired. And these don't have to be like super accurate to perspective for this project, but you will probably want to do something like this. Then you're going to turn the opacity down. You can already see like what a huge effect that has on your scene, right? If I did this, I'm also creating a focus for my lighting, which would be on this corner and specifically on this window. So I'd want to keep that, take that into account. But if this doesn't work out for you, try a few different things. Change the opacity a little bit. Another thing that you can do is you can grab, do filter, do Gaussian blur on those, and again, they'll look very 3D-ish if you do something like that. You can also, in place of that, you'll see below your paint bucket tool, there's like a little teardrop, and that's your blur tool, and you can actually paint a blur in if you have solid lines. So if I go back to this, right, I can blur some of that out. Remember, as things get further away, again, they will reduce in opacity. So you could do something like that as well, right, as the light mixes in with the shadow. Right. So I'm going to just use this layer that I created before. Another thing that you'll want to have in here is ambient occlusion. And to get good ambient occlusion, you'll probably want to go into each of these ledges one by one and add in kind of a little shelf. And to do that, you're going to grab the area underneath, do a new layer. For these, I recommend using your Airbrush Soft. Make sure it's nice and small or that you get in very close. Right, this is just a little bit of a trick of the eye, but by adding in these little ambient occlusion strips under our ledges, again, following the perspective, right, we can make things look like they're popping out, even though they're actually, as we can see, sort of flush with the building. Right, so here's my ambient occlusion layer. Remember that up near the light here, where the light's hitting it more directly, these ledges are going to have thinner strips of ambient occlusion. As you get lower, they're going to be a little bit longer. And you can add those as you see fit. Beyond that, I've got shadows for my trees. I've added in my trees. Remember that the shadows for your trees need to follow the perspective of your shadows, not the perspective of your scene. And where your shadows hit is different than where the reflection hits, right? The reflection is going to be immediately past the axis. Your shadow is cast by the light, not by the reflection. Remember to keep all of your shadows going in the same direction. Remember to keep your lights all going in the same direction. Remember to keep your reflections going in the appropriate direction as well. Okay. Beyond that, you can add in detail to your trees. I've added in a layer of just reflections from maybe some bounce light from some of the windows across the street. And I just did that with a soft round brush. And then I did an overall light pass. So for this final piece here, what you would want to do, you would grab your soft brush here, and you would just set this layer to overlay. And you could maybe do like a vignette on the scene. Maybe grab some lighter values for this area over here, right? And bump up the parts that you really sort of want to highlight. So this has been a little bit of a longer video, but I hope that this helps you sort of figure out how to do your lighting, whether you're doing a 3D or 2D. The 2D stuff, it does take a little bit longer to do. Obviously, you have to sort of calculate one thing at a time. Don't try and do all of your lighting at once. Do it layer by layer. Think about what it is, what the surface properties are of the things that you're dealing with in your scene. Are they windows and they're reflective? Are they leaves on a tree? How do those work with light? Are there shadows coming from across the street or reflections from across the street? What's the most important part of the building that you want to highlight? What part is in shadow? One part is in the sunlight? What part is being lit by another sign? These are all really important things, and you can see that rather quickly you can actually add in quite a bit of detail and volume into your scene just by changing the lighting and getting it to look about correct. Again, I just want to reiterate and reemphasize, please don't go too much further in terms of your level of detail with all of the stuff in your scene. Remember that a lot of the detail is going to come from photography, and we're going to get to that in our next project. So this one's been a little bit longer, but thanks for listening.